He crawled out of the blown-out husk of the field church with the taste of dust in his mouth and the ringing in his ears like a second heartbeat. For a long, breathless second, the world reduced itself to small things. A shard of wood clenched in his mitten, the ghost of heat on his cheek, the black pattern of sky between the torn rafters. He had been certain, as men will be in the immediate aftermath of being spared, that the worst was over. He was wrong. The road ahead, narrow, soft with December mud, littered with overturned carts and broken limbs of trees, opened onto a scene that stopped him the way the blast had not. Stacked against the low rise of a field were tight pyramids of metal cans, ranks of long cylindrical drums, and lying half-buried in snow and straw, a column of paperwork, manifests, shipping receipts, and a map with routes thumbed and penciled in by exhausted clerks. Men in olive drab lounged near the stacks, smoking with their helmets pushed back. A small truck idled, its engine tapping like a nervous animal. The smell that came off the pile was petrol, sharp, metallic, oddly domestic in the cold. They had stumbled into a supply dump. In the terse ledger found among the maps, someone later counted 50,000 gallons. For a man who had just survived the sky falling around him, the sight read like a miracle. Enough fuel to move a column, to run a battalion of tanks for a while, to fill hope into the veins of 1,000 tired vehicles. He thought it would be enough to change things. The man at the center of that moment, the survivor the witnesses later identified in unit records as Piper, had been trained to think about distance and time in terms of consumption. How many miles a motor car could drive before the needle hit empty, how quickly a tank's tracks chewed fuel in the mud and cold. He had seen engines stall like wounded beasts. He had tasted the worry that comes from knowing men are waiting for what a single jerry can buy: heat, movement, life. He remembered, years after the war, how small that pile felt when he wrote it down in a later testimony. "We thought we'd struck gold," he would say, "but it was like finding a single loaf in a city built for an army." At first, the pile felt like salvation. Men cheered in the way of exhausted people who can afford to laugh for a second. Someone cracked a tin of coffee, someone else lit a cigarette. A corporal, whose hands were stained like a mechanic's fingers, began to hand out can after can. They filled tanks, they siphoned into trucks, they strapped extra containers to the sides of jeeps and half-tracks. For a few hours on December 18, it seemed, to those who were there, that the universe had been rearranged in their favor. If only the arithmetic had been that simple.
The scrap of ledger and the smell of gasoline were not the story. They were the hinge that opened onto a larger, harder account. The war being waged not only by men and machines at the front, but by factories, pipelines, convoys, and the slow calculus of barrels and gallons. The German offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, carried with it hopes that were already rationed by planning. High Command had budgeted fuel in the millions of gallons for the operation, a figure rounded and reiterated in staff minutes, roughly 5 million gallons allocated for the push. The problem was not an absence of plans. The problem was delivery. By the time the first columns moved, those allocations had been carved away by reality. Records later admitted that only about half of what had been promised actually arrived where and when it was needed. Tanks were supposed to be fed with a regularity that the roads, the weather, and Allied interference would not permit. That shortfall, the difference between paper and pavement, is the place where heroic gestures lose traction against logistics. A Panther in action could, under heavy stress, burn over a gallon per mile more than its quiet road rating. A Tiger, with its furnace of an engine and its appetite for torque, could devour fuel at rates roughly estimated at multiple gallons per mile as it clawed through snow and embankment. Vehicles idling on choke points, engines thinned by cold, and long lines of marching men waiting for the next ration meant that the daily consumption of an attacking force blew through any optimistic ledger. The Americans, by contrast, had been methodically turning their advantage in industrial capacity into a network that ran on time and in bulk. Two logistical innovations get mentioned together in almost every post-action analysis: the Red Ball Express and Pluto. The Red Ball was a system of dedicated truck convoys, drivers fed on coffee, speed, and purpose, hauling petroleum and ammunition from ports and depots into frontline arteries. Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, quietly stitched fuel from liberated ports to the engine rooms of the continent. When these systems are described in the files, the language is clinical but telling. Continuous delivery, redundant paths, capacity measured in the hundreds of thousands and more. What that looked like on the ground to an advancing German unit was not bureaucracy but abundance. Where an exposed squad had found 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, Allied logistics could, when ordered, marshal fuel by the millions. That asymmetry was not simply arithmetic, it was psychological. German soldiers saw in the weeks that followed not a scarcity they could overcome with courage, but a culture of supply that treated fuel as disposable. This is the fulcrum on which the rest of the story tilts.
For the men who stumbled on jerry cans that morning, the discovery was a temporary uplift. For their commanders, the ledger and the map were a reminder of a harder truth. Capturing a few tens of thousands of gallons did not alter the strategic balance. The Allies had enough to be clinical about denial. Where a German column might need every can, the American command could make the rational but brutal decision to burn stores rather than risk them falling into enemy hands. You don't capture the war with what you can pick up on a dark road, a platoon diary put it bluntly. You win it by denying the enemy what he needs to breathe. Even to say that in the pale light of that field was to feel a chill worse than the December air. Driving deeper into the Ardennes, columns were slowed by the same things that slow any mechanized army trying to push across constrained terrain. Roads built for slower times, melting snow turning cartways into ruts, bridges that were either gone or watched by small parties of defenders. Delays have a fuel cost. Engines that should have purringly carried a division forward sat idling. Men left heaters running in command cars to keep radios working. Pumps ran to warm oil. All tiny leaks that, summed across days and distance, became decisive. The narrowness of the lanes forced tanks into single columns. Each stalled vehicle became a furnace for suspicion and waste. A tiger stuck in a rut consumed not just fuel, but time and attention. A panther, coaxed forward by engineers and men working in grease, left a trail of consumption that bent the logistics scheduler's pencil. In the cramped notation of unit manifests, consumption numbers were blunt. The front ate fuel in a way that made the neat graphs of staff officers meaningless. Meanwhile, Allied convoys moved with a kind of industrial predictability that, to German eyes, looked obscene. Where the Germans salvaged and rationed, the Americans could be wasteful by design. Surplus at rear area dumps, fuel deliberately spilled from trucks while crews cleared routes, stockpiles meant to sustain an entire army group. The sight of cargo left in the open under freezing skies, temporary kitchens lit and then abandoned, men at ease, turned something in the German imagination. It was not only that the enemy had more, it was that he allowed himself more. A few days after the Hansfeld find, the newcomer to the ranks of that knowledge, Piper, felt the shock at two levels. Practically, he watched his men siphon what they could into tanks and cans. Emotionally, he watched the ledger and realized their calculations had been made against a false horizon. That night, around a patrol fire, one of his sergeants voiced what they all knew but had not said. "We found cans. We didn't find victory." Documents captured later, shipping manifests, convoy schedules tucked into binders and then left behind, tell a different story than the human ones.
They record convoys arriving, pipelines pumping, quantities tallied at ports and transfer points. To translate these into the human language of a muddy road and a smoking field is to return to our survivor. He slept that night on cold ground with a bitter realization. Surviving a bombing had preserved his body, but it had not changed the rules that governed whether his army could move, feed, and fight. Victory, he began to suspect, would be decided not by the courage of the next firefight, but by what flowed down from docks and spool houses, by how many gallons could be measured between supply and need. Word of captures and losses traveled by rumor and by official report, often in the same breath. In one later interrogation, a German company officer wrote of seeing American drivers toss empty cans like refuse, and of troops who treated fuel as one more item among many. They behaved as if the stuff had no consequence, he recorded in a debriefing cited by an intelligence summary. That astonishment had a cost. Men who had grown up under rationing laws and scarcity could not easily imagine such a surplus. and the cognitive dissonance fed into faster demoralization than bullets ever did. Not all encounters were benign. The Ardennes is ugly with desperation in places, and atrocities occurred that must be named. The massacre at Malmedy stands as a crime that shocked commanders on both sides and soured the moral clarity of the campaign. Records link a chain of retribution, fear, and the breakdown of discipline to the pressures of the offensive. Historians and witnesses have condemned what happened there not as an accident of battle, but as a criminal act. To dwell on its brutality is necessary for truth, but not for spectacle. It sits in this narrative as a grim footnote to the larger lesson that when supply lines collapse, moral collapse can follow. That same collapse of provision showed itself in other ways. Men abandoned vehicles for lack of fuel. In some cases, crews walked away from intact tanks because the orders and the fuel that made them part of a coordinated armored thrust did not arrive. Where the German commanders had imagined breakthrough, the decisive maneuver that might create a bargaining chip, they increasingly found what they could not carry. The countryside filled with hulks, armored silhouettes frozen in place with turret guns trained toward horizons they would never see move. Between December 16th and December 24th, the arithmetic became clearer. Every day of delay cost gallons, every detour chewed reserves, every idled engine leaked potential. Captain-level reports began to echo the same conclusion. There simply was not enough flow to sustain the tempo the campaign required. Staff officers scanned maps and inbound telegrams and then looked up with the same expression of worried calculation. From the Allied side, the calculus was clinical and, in its own way, brutal. Where a fuel dump could be captured, it could also be denied.
On the night their forces cleared areas vulnerable to enemy capture, American commanders made choices with iron logic. If a depot might fall into German hands and offer them a leap forward, better to render it unusable than to leave it as a gift. The verifiable act of denying a resource could mean burning it, breaking piping, detonating tanks. Within the language of operations, scorched reads like a dry verb. In practice, it meant millions of gallons of petroleum going up in smoke, a decision signaled by orders and carried out by engineers tasked with that grim work. When the first news reached the men near Hansfeld that a more substantial depot at Stavelo had been set alight to prevent capture, the reaction was bewilderment seasoned with a new bitterness. This was not the loss of a few jerry cans. The St. Stavelo site, listed in several after-action notes under the name Stavelo, would come to be described in unit files as holding on the order of 2 million gallons. To watch that go up was to see the enemy exercise a kind of wealth one could not wrest into a pocket and carry away. A sergeant who watched the skyline the morning the fires took hold later wrote in a statement that survives in an intelligence file, "It was as if the sky had been set on a nail, black smoke like a column, and then a heat that made you step back. We understood then that the thing we had thought would save us would be burned rather than given to us." The note reads with the bluntness of men forced into accounting for defeat. The psychological impact of such an image multiplied the tactical problem. Men who had known hunger and rationing felt the insult of the burning as an existential judgment. Not only were they under-resourced, but the enemy could afford to destroy an abundance on purpose. Commanders had to reconcile the shame of that loss with a new urgency to find their own sources or to conserve what they had left. It changed orders, it changed timelines, and it changed morale. Back at the small pile in Hansfeld, the immediate effects were practical and petty. Jerry cans siphoned dry, men bickering over who had the right to a drum, engines cranking only to die when someone misjudged a siphoning. Yet these everyday frictions were the visible manifestations of the larger incapacity. For a while, a few tanks rolled forward, their drivers hoping that captured petrol would carry them through to the supply point on the map. Distance, terrain, and Allied interdiction turned that hope into a gamble more often than not. In staff rooms and on maps, the arithmetic remained stubbornly objective. A division's allocation had been counted in millions of gallons on paper. The receipts on the ground told a different story. The lesson unfolded not as a single revelation, but as a series of small catastrophes. The quartermaster who could not find the manifest, the convoy returning to base because roads were held up, the radio call that came too late to change a routing. Each confirmed a thesis that would harden in every dispatch and archive. In modern mechanized war, industrial throughput, pipelines, convoys, ports, and the factories that fed them shape outcomes more faithfully than valor does alone. As the days in December tightened into winter, the survivor who had crawled from under the church found himself moving through a landscape that taught him the same lesson over and over. He would, years later and in quieter places, try to describe the shape of it, the way a tank's empty sightline toward an Allied-held road looked more like a verdict than a pause, the way a column of smoke from far off could change a plan overnight, the way a map of the enemy's logistics began to impose itself on the human story of beats and bravery. He did not yet know, when he first saw Hansfeld, the scale of the denial that would follow, or the enormity of the decisions being taken out of sight. He did know hunger and cold and the shame of empty tanks. He knew in the marrow of his bones that surviving a blast was one thing, surviving the slow, grinding arithmetic of supply was quite another. In those first nights after the discovery, words circulated that the enemy had a network of convoys called the Red Ball Express, that a line under the channel moved fuel silently, that if forced, those in command would rather turn their own treasures to smoke than hand them over. Men argued around small fires, sometimes in bitterness, sometimes in practical planning. "We can only take so much," one lieutenant muttered, folding the manifest he had smoothed with thumbs already stained, "and it isn't enough to change where the war is going." So they took what they could. They hoarded in small, furtive ways. They poured into tanks, and men walked with a few jerry cans tied to belts. The immediate victory of survival coexisted with the magnitude of need. The narrative that began with a man walking away from a bomb blast started unfolding in his mind into a much larger and more terrible map, one where factories and routes and the epic calculations of engineers, and not only the courage of men in battle, would determine the next moves. News slipped through, reports of other captures, of depots reduced to blackening stumps, of ordnance blown to make it meaningless, of convoys delayed by ambushes but sent nonetheless. The broader campaign showed its seams in a million management failures and successes. There were small successes, a bridge taken, a column that made it, but none of them by themselves altered the rising sense of futility. The man who had survived the bombing began to understand a different sequence, that some survivals are beginnings, not ends. The end to be feared now was not the burst of a bomb, but the slow revelation that the enemy had recast war as a contest of production lines and pipelines.
A final, stark image threaded its way through the men's reports. Photographs taken by intelligence units later showed blackened ground and tracks leading from smoking stacks of drums, but also empty fields, where entire depots had been deliberately rendered useless. In one of those notes, an American engineer's account, recorded in later testimony, the decision to burn rather than lose supplies is described with mechanical clarity. "We set the depot alight. Better it be ash than a gift." The cold rationality of that line would haunt German recollections for years to come. And yet, in the immediate present, there was still work to do. The captured cans at Hansfeld had to be catalogued. Drivers had to be bribed with cigarettes to stay awake and move what could be moved. The man called Piper found himself pressed into small, urgent choices. Which vehicle to fill? Which crew to send forward? How many men to feed from what little they had? It was the kind of practical leadership that makes sense of survival, but not the kind that turns it into strategic advantage. By the end of that third day, as snow turned to slush and the radio waves hummed with orders and news, the mood had shifted from brief jubilation to a kind of deliberate, ashamed calculation. The ledger lay open on a crate, and in cramped handwriting, someone had added a line that felt like a diagnosis. The amount captured at Hansfeld was measurable. The enemy's delivery capability was not just larger, but ruthlessly so. If the war would be decided by who could move the most fuel over the worst roads, the verdict was no longer in doubt. Far off on the horizon, in the direction of the larger depots, a column of smoke began to climb on the morning of the day they would later name in reports. It was a thin, distant thread at first, something like a promise of news, but it cut the low winter light and gestured toward the element that would change everything. Men stopped where they were, turning toward the shape, as if toward a thundercloud of fate. They had survived the blast. They had crawled from under wreckage. They had believed for a few short hours that what they had found might save them.
What came next would force the choice: to chase a supply that might not exist, to hold ground without the means to keep it, to watch as an enemy with industrial abundance made decisions indifferent to individual need. As the smoke thickened and as messengers came running with orders and rumors, the survivor waited at the edge of the road and felt in his bones that the real test was just beginning. If he had thought survival was an ending, it now stood revealed as a beginning of an entirely different, slower peril, the peril of a war decided by mills and pipelines rather than by the daring of a single man. If you enjoy deep dive history, subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden mechanics of war.
The reports that trickled in over the radio that day were terse but consequential. A major depot, Stavalo, had been deliberately rendered unusable. The numbers attached to it in fragmentary intelligence ran into the millions. Guards who had been sent to secure the site found instead a theater of engineered denial. Tanks breached, valves torched, drums overturned and chained to be set alight if the order came. Engineers assigned to that grim task carried with them priming cords and incendiary charges. For them, the calculus was simple and severe: deny and destroy. From their vantage, some miles away, the men around Hansfeld watched a column of smoke grow fatter as the morning advanced. It rose black and stubborn against a sky that had been pale and bracing only hours before. Faces around the small fires hardened. For a time, the whole scene seemed unreal. They had survived an enemy bombing, found what seemed like salvation, and now were witnessing the deliberate incineration of a supply that might have sustained them for weeks. Orders moved like a second current under all this. Commanders argued over priorities. Quartermasters cursed the insufficiency of manifests, and a whispered fear traversed the ranks, not of another bombing, but of a slowly closing margin. The man who had lived through the blast now counted the cost of being spared. He had escaped death only to watch the tools for survival be judged dispensable by those who could afford such cruelty. As the sun slid and the column of smoke became a black daymark, he tightened his coat and made a small private promise to remember the ledger and the map and the smell of gasoline. He could not yet know how many tanks would be abandoned by night or how many miles the men would be forced to walk for lack of fuel. He could not know the precise number of barrels that would go up in flame or the final shape of retreats and surrenders. But the pattern was forming: industrial capacity, not the random generosity of fate or the bravery of a single squad, was settling the score. The road ahead was a line of decisions. Men who had been saved from the bomb now stood at the threshold of having to decide how to move through a world where fuel, not bullets, defined the next steps. The names in the manifest were small and mortal: drivers and clerks and loaders, the people whose labor turned paper numbers into the movement of armies. They would be the agents of what came next, whether that was a march forward until engines sputtered out, or a retreat measured in the fitful, grinding calculus of a campaign collapsing under its own lack of supply. And in that cold, as the smoke thickened on the horizon and the ledger lay open under a hand that had been steadied by too many explosions, he thought of the blast he had survived. Surviving it had been, in the narrowest sense, a triumph of chance and courage. It had not been the end. It had been an entrance. The true test, he now understood, would ask more than one moment of audacity. It would demand the endurance of a nation's factories and the discipline of a supply chain. It would ask whether systems, pipelines, convoys, and factory lines could sustain the meaning of survival long enough for men like him to turn spared life into victory. At the edge of the field, a rider came in with a final, urgent message. Further back, columns were stalled, engines cooling, men waiting. The note was clear in its bluntness. If the depots burned as ordered, if the enemy could not be denied, they would soon have nothing to fuel a single tank. The man known as Piper folded the manifest into his pocket and rose to his feet, the winter air tasting of iron and petrol, and a newly dawning resolve. He had lived through a bombing against all odds. What came next was not a promise, but a demand, and it would reach far beyond any one man's survival. He folded the manifest into his pocket and rose to his feet, winter air cutting at his face as if to remind him that thought and movement were different things. Orders came and went like loose paper: a radio pulse ordering reconnaissance, a courier sent to beg fuel from another column, a message sent back to say, "Hold where you are."
Piper moved with the small, urgent cadence of a man whose immediate choices could change a handful of lives. He did not yet have the power to change supply lines. The next hours were a study in what limited agency looked like inside a logistical tragedy. Drivers were roped to their tasks with cigarettes and promises of extra rations. Muskets were slung for the moment but not used, because the nearest meaningful engagement depended upon movement that fuel alone could permit. Men emptied cans into tanks through funnel mouths improvised from tin and glove leather. They siphoned with breath that fogged and turned to ice on the edges of metal. Where the captured petrol touched a cold engine, it seemed almost a protest being asked to perform miracles. Across the Ardennes, the campaign's tempo slowed into a series of halting efforts. Columns that ought to have been a coordinated hammer became a string of independent knots, each waiting on a neighbor and each costing more fuel while it waited. The arithmetic was cruel and cumulative. A stalled petrol pump meant heaters ran longer and command cars to keep radios alive. A blocked bridge meant trucks took detours and added miles to their day. A single broken axle on a supply trailer could hold up an entire convoy while men crawled into wheel hubs to coax frozen grease into motion. All of these were small things, enough to make any staff officer's need calculations dissolve into the reality of mud, ice, and men who could not be replaced. There were moments of small rescue. A tank found a pocket of fuel, and for a day the men who rode in it felt absurdly like victors. They moved a few kilometers, surprised at how far a can or two could carry them.
For those hours, they tasted something close to optimism. Radio chatter lightened. A laugh slipped out around a field stove. But those moves were blips against a larger map. By the time reconnaissance returned their reports, they often told of clogged routes or of American patrols showing unexpected presence along lateral roads. Every extra mile burned in a heavy gearbox was an accounting against the future. At command level, the argument hardened. Maps annotated with supply points and allocated gallons were rechecked until officers' eyes burned. The staff did what staff do in a crisis. They rerouted, they reprioritized, they wheeled units in and out of lines based on where a truck column could be spared. But there are limits to improvisation when the system that should replenish you runs on the scale of factories and seaports. The Germans, in this offensive, discovered a structural fact. You could plan a blitz in rooms full of maps and coffee cups, but the ground would have its own mathematics. Messages from high command supply a grim litany. Delivery shortfalls acknowledged. Priority to Panzer Group. Expect reductions. The wording was clinical, almost bureaucratic. It veiled a moral shock that would radiate outward. Men at the front, reading the lines of text, folded the paper and thought of warm rooms and of the faces of boys who had trusted orders. For Piper, the manifest in his pocket became less a promise and more a proof. Paper could say anything, only steel and gallons told the truth. The deliberate burning at Stavolo became, in the minds of thousands, the emblem of this truth. The column of smoke they had seen from their vantage did not simply mark a denied depot. It meant that the enemy's choices were measured on scales they could not match. For the engineers who executed the denial, practicalities governed. Valves and drains hut, incendiary cords laid to ensure ignition, flammable accelerants placed where a single spark would guarantee conflagration. The act was efficient and uncompromising, an industrial decision applied in the field. Watching that decision from miles away, men felt the double sting. First, that a resource they could not replace had been taken from them. Second, that it had been taken not by chance but by calculation. There was humiliation in it, a sense that the world's arithmetic favored one side so heavily that it could afford to burn treasure to keep the other from tasting it. That humiliation showed itself in petty thefts and in bickering, in voices raised over who had taken which can, in petty violence that only hinted at deeper fractures. It also showed itself in quieter, weightier ways, in commanders' shoulders, in letters home that had the edges of someone who had compressed dignity to keep moving. As the days pressed on and the offensive lost its shimmer, the terrain itself began to write the story of failure.
Tanks and armored cars were not always destroyed by shells. Often they were left because no fuel or orders remained to make them useful. Crews unstrapped themselves from their seats and walked toward distant villages or rear areas, dragging with them cold boots and a sense of being unmoored. A tank abandoned with its turret swiveled to stare down an empty road is not merely a vehicle left. It is a relic of choice, the choice to stop feeding a piece of machinery because the system cannot feed everything. Prisoners began to appear in larger numbers. Men who had been ordered to press forward found themselves separated from command as columns disintegrated into small groups moving on foot. Those who were captured told interrogators the same two themes. First, that they had not expected the Allies' industrial depth. Second, that their own command structure had faltered under the stress of scarcity. It is one thing to fight, it is another to maintain the chain that allows fighting to keep happening. In interviews and in after-action statements, the phrase, "we ran out of what we needed," came up with a repetitiveness that made it sound less like accusation and more like arithmetic. The psychological effects were as decisive as the material ones. Men who had been raised in regimes of rationing met an enemy that seemed to waste resources, and the sight unsettled them in ways no bullet ever could. Some reacted with bitter envy, some with desperate attempts to take or hide what they could, others with a bleak resignation that this particular confrontation was no longer within their capacity to decide. Small units, once the locus of tactical ingenuity, became instead the victims of systemic shortage. High-level responses came in the form of desperate gambits and recriminations. Commands that had banked on mobility found themselves forced into a slower calculus. Conserve what you can, withdraw where you must. Do not gamble tanks on roads where fuel cannot be guaranteed. Orders flowed back to those waiting at Hansfield. Hold, conserve, fall back if necessary. Those instructions were the opposite of what many commanders wanted. They were defensive in nature and acknowledged a strategic shift. To concede mobility was to concede initiative. There were human stories threaded through all this. A driver who had kept his convoy together by sheer force of personality was mortified to watch his trailer sold for parts to keep someone else's radio running. A young lieutenant who had been promoted because he had once found a quick route through marshland stood in the snow and listened to soldiers say the thing they had been trained to say but did not mean: "We cannot move them, we cannot feed them." It is in those private failings, told later in letters and depositions, that the public story of routes and barrels finds its skin. At command levels in Berlin, the calculus acquired a political shape. High officials listened to reports and demanded explanations.
The intersection between production on the home front and delivery to the front became a sharp line of accountability. Ministers, distributors, and officers pointed at one another across maps. For those in charge of material production, the problem was not will, but capacity. Machines and factories vibrated under the strain, and yet steel and fuel are produced at a pace that needs forethought, raw materials, and a secure transit system. When the transit system breaks or is denied, production's effect cannot instantly be multiplied by will. Allied logisticians, by contrast, were busy with a different logic. The Red Ball Express and similar organizations did not merely send trucks out, they designed redundancy. Routes were cleared and re-cleared, new drivers recruited and trained, priorities shifted to feed armor and aircraft. When the choice came to deny depots, the decision was made with an economy that saw the loss of gallons as less important than the denial of strategic advantage. It is a hard calculus. Destroy a stockpile and accept the immediate loss of goods to prevent the enemy from using them as the kernel of renewed offensive power. This calculus rippled into the personal lives of those who carried it out. Engineers who set fire to drums did so under orders, in cold weather and under the weight of consequences. They worked with detachment and precision. Valves opened, accelerants poured, knowing their task was to convert usable goods into ash. Some kept their distance, their faces screened with soot. Others later wrote of feeling an awed shame at what they had done. There is a particular kind of guilt that comes from destroying abundance intentionally. Guilt not for haste, but for the knowledge that human beings on both sides will pay the moral price. News from other sectors only deepened the mood of resignation. Reports of ambulances waiting in rear areas without fuel, of supply trains sidetracked or intercepted, of aircraft grounded because tanks on the ground could not be fed. All these arrived like small sermons of failure. Propaganda on both sides tried to spin events, but soldiers and staff learned to read the maps themselves. When convoys ran 30 hours late or bridges were impassable, the numbers on the paper stopped being predictions and became the limits of possibility. When the offensive finally showed signs of unraveling, it did so in ways both grand and intimate. The grand signs were the retreating formations, the radio codes reversed, and the withdrawal orders that arrived through channels previously used for attack. The intimate signs were the boots abandoned in a ditch, the letter unopened because it would have stung too much, the photograph of a child folded into a pocket that would not be seen again. To historians, these things might resolve into timelines and causal charts. To men in the field, they were moments of loss and of small human reckonings.
There were consequences for leadership.
Some commanders were relieved or reassigned. Others were questioned in detail about their supply decisions. A scattering of officers were captured. Interrogations conducted later sought to draw lines between decisions on the spot and the larger failure of the campaign. It is important to say plainly that such inquiries did not exculpate the systemic realities that had set many of these men up for failure. Individuals make choices within frameworks that constrain them. When the framework is brittle, even competent decisions can be overwhelmed. At home, in the towns and workshops that produced the oils, rubbers, and steel, the picture was different and sometimes invisible to the man on the road. Ports processed crude and shipped it through pipelines like Pluto, spool by spool. Refineries worked to convert barrels into the blend the engines needed. Driveless and convoys came from many places and kept their own rhythms. The American system could be wasteful by design because its baseline was abundant. Where German strategy had to be economized and precise, Allied logistics could afford risk and redundancy. All of this is to say that what began as the story of a man surviving a bombing widened until it became almost an anatomy of modern warfare. Piper's survival remained the human hinge. Everything that followed, Hansfeld, the stolen hours of joy, the burning of Stavelot, the abandonment of machines, the morale collapse, was an unfolding of the thesis that industrial capacity determines outcomes as profoundly as courage does. In quieter moments after the offensive subsided, survivors wrote and spoke. They offered testimonies that read like an attempt to translate experience into lesson. One man, writing years later, captured the paradox in a line that returned again and again in unit recollections. Surviving a bomb is an instant. Surviving the arithmetic of supply is a lifetime. Another, in a debriefing, recorded a sentence that would be quoted by analysts for years. They could afford to burn. We could not afford to be greedy enough to imagine otherwise. These words were not posturing. They were the blunt instruments of memory trying to shape sense from chaos. The moral toll of the campaign extended beyond tanks and fuel. Where logistics faltered, discipline sometimes crumbled, and with it came crimes that stain any strategic account. The massacre at Malmedy, referred to in many reports, remains a searing reminder that desperation and rage can lead to atrocity. The record condemns such acts unequivocally. Acknowledging them is part of honoring truth. They are not incidental footnotes, but central tragedies that must be faced without euphemism. The pressure of scarcity and the breakdown of command disciplines do not excuse these crimes. They are conditions in which the worst human impulses can be unleashed, and that must be remembered. Post-war, the lessons were sifted and argued over in cold rooms.
Analysts returned to the numbers. How many gallons moved through pipelines? How many through convoys? What percentage of allocated oil ever reached the front? How consumption rates multiplied under stress? Those who wrote of production emphasized one central fact. Factories and supply lines are not just backdrops to battle, they are active participants. The capacity to produce and to deliver was not simply a material advantage, it was a strategic one that could be wielded to affect outcomes on the battlefield. Piper himself lived long enough to see the debate move from arguments about tactics to studies about systems. He testified in fragments, sometimes in official settings, and sometimes in letters to former comrades. When he spoke, he returned often to the ledger in his pocket and to the smell of gasoline in the snow. He remembered a childlike surge of hope at finding the cans. He remembered the subsequent shame and bewilderment at seeing the great blaze on the horizon. For him, the war had been a teacher that issued harsh curricula. Survival at one moment can be a prelude to another kind of test. He had passed the first, but been caught by the second. There are images that remain vivid in his recollections and in photographs that survived the campaign. A Tiger tank sitting with engine hatches open and a latch forever stuck. A line of half-tracks abandoned with their canvas flapping like flags of surrender. A stretch of road pocked with tracks that tell the story of back-and-forth movement until motion itself lost meaning. In one later photograph, taken by an intelligence unit and filed away in a cold archive, a single jerry can rests upright, cap closed, in the snow beside a crate. It looks tiny against the landscape. The photographer wrote on the negative sleeve, "Evidence." Years later, when museums would set up displays of the conflict, some of those abandoned machines would be polished and put behind ropes. Visitors would peer into hatches and read placards about armor and tactics. A diesel gauge, forever frozen on empty, would sit beneath glass with a small brass plaque. To the casual observer, the empty needle might read like an artifact of technology. To those who had been there, it read as a verdict. An industry of movement can be the arbiter of fate. Piper visited such a museum once, older, the map in his pocket long since gone, and he stood for a long time before an open hatch. The winter light slanted across the tank's metal and turned it to bruise. He thought of the field and the smell of petrol and of the line of smoke that had once cut the sky. What survives in memory and in archive is not a simple moral about bravery or about machines. It is instead a layered lesson about how wars of the modern era unfold. The courage of individuals and the cruelty of structural constraints exist together. Acts of gallantry do not vanish in a logistical order. They are real and costly.
But if the infrastructure that feeds an army is broken, those acts become isolated and, tragically, insufficient. The narrative that began with a man stepping free from wreckage and tasting dust on his lips ended for him in a quieter understanding. Surviving the blast had given him a second life, but that life was not guaranteed victory. Instead, it compelled him to witness a larger truth. When he thought back, years later in a quieter place, he described the feeling as an inversion of hope. Where he had expected safety after surviving, he found instead obligation. The obligation was to remember that nations fight on multiple fronts at once, against enemy soldiers, yes, but also against entropy, distance, weather, and the limits of production. If there is a single image that keeps returning in the files and in testimonies, it is that of choice. The choice to burn 2 million gallons rather than allow them to tip the balance. The choice to conserve a single can because it might keep a radio working. The choice to walk away from a tank because saving the crew mattered more than saving a machine. Those choices, taken together, became the grammar of victory and defeat in a campaign defined by logistical extremes. Piper carried the ledger not as a trophy, but as a lesson. Survival had proven to be not a punctuation mark, but the opening of a sentence that ran through maps, factories, and the hands of drivers who kept engines alive at the cost of sleep and blood. He had been spared the immediate violence of the bomb, and through that narrow escape, he had seen, with painful clarity, how the broad machinery of war could render a single survival empty unless it was sustained by the nation's capacity to produce and move. In the end, the Ardennes offensive dissolved under the weight of these realities. Troops withdrew, the front line maps were redrawn, and the accounts were written. The physical damage, smoldering depots, abandoned armor, destitute roads, would scar the countryside for years. The human cost, lives lost, innocents burned, crimes committed, would take longer to reckon. The technical lesson, that supplies, production, and pipelines are central to modern combat, would be recited in academic halls and staff colleges and would shape doctrine for decades. But for the man who had crawled from the blown-out church, the lesson was simpler and more personal. Surviving one kind of violent ending does not mean surviving all endings. He had been given a chance to keep living. That chance asked of him a new kind of courage, the patience to understand systems, the humility to accept forces larger than himself, and the responsibility to remember and to tell. The ledger in his pocket was a map of that education. He walked away from the field not with a sense of triumph, but with a slow, steady resolve to bear witness. He would tell what he had seen, the small joy of finding fuel, the bitter sight of columns of smoke, the abandonment of machines that had once symbolized power, and the way a nation's capacity altered the fate of soldiers who thought their courage alone could decide outcomes. He would say, quietly and without triumphalism, that modern war is as much about pipelines as about bravery, and that to understand one without the other is to misunderstand both. If this story surprised you, share and comment. What surprised you most about what decided this battle?